So hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of 10 Questions About Cloud. Today we have a very special guest. I'm a huge fan of his Serverless podcast, actually. Welcome, Jeremy Daly.
Thank you for having me, Pablo.
So the pleasure is mine. And let's start the podcast as usual. The first question is basically to introduce yourself. So who you are, what you do.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm Jeremy Daly. I am currently the GM of Serverless Cloud at Serverless Inc. It's a recent position I just took on. The idea is to basically build a platform that makes serverless easier and more accessible to everyone. Because I think if people have been following serverless from its roots maybe 6 years ago or so, they've seen that it has become more and more complex and harder to get started, even though underlying simplicity is still there. So that has been a big motivation of mine for quite some time, is to try to recapture that simplicity and make it really easy for people to get started with serverless. So that is my current role, but I also am pretty heavily involved in the community. As you mentioned, I have my Serverless Chats podcast that I do every week. I have a guest from the industry. We just, sort of like this idea of, hanging out with somebody at a conference or something like that and just chatting about a subject that you're really interested in and passionate about, and sharing that information back and forth. So that's what the podcast is about. And then every week, because I am just like a news junkie, I have to know what's going on with all different things. I publish a newsletter every week called the Off by None newsletter that basically is, it's sort of an aggregation of all of the links and stories and industry news and expert analysis from other amazing people in the industry, about serverless and modern application development. And I publish that every week, so that you can sign up for that at offbynone.io.
Okay, that's really interesting, actually. I'm already signed up into that newsletter. So let's talk now about your cloud journey.
Sure.
I'm curious about when was the first time that you heard about the cloud? And maybe you can tell us also your first steps.
I actually started building websites and web applications all the way back in 1997. So I've been doing this for a very long time. I was in my dorm room. One of my suite mates showed me a website he just built, and I was like blown away. I'm like, how do you do that? And so I spent basically the next 20 some odd years of my life, doing that. So I started building websites, and actually I got to a point where I started my own agency. I was building websites for other companies, and then we got into hosting. So at first we were using co-location facilities, or we were using just, the companies you paid for to host websites. Then we actually got into co-location facilities. So I went through the whole thing of actually installing servers into a rack and doing all the networking and worrying about all that kind of stuff, and, patching wires and making Ethernet cables. So I went through that whole journey. And then in 2008, I had already been running my web development company for about, I think, 10 years at that point. At that point, about 10 years. And so I was just ready to kind of move on from that and sell that off. And I was starting to work on a new project, because we figured, hey, I'm always building websites for other people. Why not build a website that, this was when Twitter was coming out and all these other things. Facebook had been around for a couple of years at that point. So we tried to build another social network platform. I think it's probably a common story from that time. So we were looking into how we were going to build this thing and how we were going to scale. And we said, well, if we're selling off this company, how are we going to host it, whatever. And then we discovered cloud. And we immediately looked at AWS. That was sort of the one that was out there at the time. And so we started playing around with EC2 instances and elastic load balancers and some of that stuff. And one of the first things we did was actually move all of our hosting infrastructure from our co-location facility into EC2 instances, and had a couple EC2 instances running, as well as, I think this was before RDS, because we actually installed SQL Server, I think 2008 at that point, on an EC2 instance, and was running, we're running it there. But we moved everything over. And so just from a comparison in terms of how we knew the cloud was something really interesting, was we were paying somewhere around maybe $6,000 to $7,000 a month for our co-location facility, for bandwidth, for servers that we were renting from Dell or leasing from Dell, and some of these other things the power, redundant power, all kinds of stuff. When we took that and moved it into the cloud, our bill was $700 a month. So it was about I don't know, it's a 90% reduction or whatever it is, a huge reduction in the cost of going from on-prem to the cloud. And the other cool thing about that was the fact that I didn't have to drive an hour to the co-location facility at 2:00 in the morning when a drive went down or something like that. So that was the first time we got into the cloud. And as soon as we did that, everything else, I said, I'm never hosting or having my own server again.
I can understand that. I mean, yeah, it's really inspiring story because you started really from the very beginning, and then how step by step you move into the cloud. I mean, it's a very classical story. However, it's really cool because when I started the cloud, the on-premise world was already old for me, you know?
Right.
I'm kind of cloud native, so to say. Maybe it's because of my age. However, very interesting. So you have that background and that deep understanding on the technical side also.
It makes you appreciate the cloud more if you've ever had to live in that on-prem world.
Yeah, I can see that. So this leads us to the next question, which is related to the advantages of the cloud. You already mentioned a few of them, but maybe you can just tell us about, in your opinion, what are other big advantages?
Yeah, I mean, if you're moving from on-prem to the cloud, I mean, the biggest advantage there is just not having to deal with servers. I mean, basically, even if they're virtual machines, we had a setup where we were using VMware and we had, Blade servers and we were sharing hosts and things like that. But in our co-location facility, but when you move to the cloud, I mean, everything is just so you don't even think about hardware anymore, right? And you need to think about power and how much power you need and what size server you might need depending on what kind of workloads you're building. But I think the biggest advantage when you move to cloud is just the fact that it allows you to focus on things that are sort of more important and move and grow very, very quickly. Because one of the things we had the problem with the on-prem world was if we needed more servers, we had to order them from Dell, wait a couple of weeks for them to come in, go rack them, get them all configured, all set up. That takes weeks. And basically with the cloud, you just turn compute power on instantaneously. And from an EC2 perspective, and thinking about virtual machines in the AWS world, being able to just flip on an EC2 and being able to install some software is super great. But being able to use Fargate and just dump a container in there, or serverless even better, using Lambda functions and just write a little bit of code and stick that in there. I mean, you immediately have as much compute power as you want without any of the hassle of dealing with another team to install that stuff or you doing it yourself or whatever. So I think that's the big advantage for any company that is looking to, sort of grow quickly. Even something like DigitalOcean is still better than trying to host it on your own. But I just feel like with these public cloud providers, it just gives you the ability to grow so quickly and get exactly what you need so you can remove all those blockers, which essentially used to exist all the time in the on-prem world.
Yeah, you described very, very well. I totally agree on that. On the time to market, it's reduced a lot. And
right.
You just focus on your product, on developing your product, and you kind of forget about the infrastructure, the hardware side, which is essentially amazing because you just focus on your product and forget about anything else. And this is amazing, essentially.
Totally agree.
So let's continue now, because I believe that cloud computing knowledge or skills are going to be kind of a standard in the IT industry. If not now, in the coming years. What do you believe about that? Do you think? Do you agree on that? You don't agree? I mean, it's just something which I believe.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think that if you are starting your if you're starting your developer career or development or application engineer career, whatever career you're doing, I mean, even if you're an SRE, if you're into, DevOps and automation and that sort of stuff, the cloud is the future. And I think what we've seen with AWS Outposts, which is the ability for you to basically install a giant rack in your own data center that essentially runs AWS locally in your data center for you. That's just where we're going, right? So the technologies that are being built for the cloud, managed services, things like that, all of those things are becoming the standards. Of what you need to know in order to be productive and grow. So if you're graduating from college and you've got a computer science degree, for example, that's great. But I interviewed one of my last consulting projects. I had to interview a bunch of engineers to start, a lot of junior engineers, and I would say out of the maybe 100 people that I spoke with, maybe 15% or so had actually done anything in the cloud. Most people were just doing things on a server or on university servers and things like that. And I think if you enter the job market at that level, you're going to be at a serious disadvantage. I can understand it now because it often takes universities and colleges a little bit of time to sort of catch up with the current technology. And this has moved really fast. I mean, the last 12 years have been a blur in terms of how quickly technology has moved and how much we've moved into the cloud. But I would say that is definitely something that you have to know. Now, in terms of the actual skill sets that you need to know in there, if you're a developer, then you need to know the modern languages, right? I mean, people are still writing in Java for enterprises, but people are moving fast with Go and with Rust and with what else? I mean, Python is still a popular language. JavaScript still remains the most popular language out there. So definitely start understanding more modern languages. If you're stuck in the C world or just Java, in terms of working for startups or fast-moving businesses, that might not be the best foundation for. I mean, it's a good foundation to have. Computer science is a good foundation, and it's a good language foundation. But you do want to think about some of these other languages, and I would spend some time learning those. The other thing is that you definitely have to look at containers. I'm a huge fan of serverless, and I wish everything was serverless, but containers have so much gravity right now with Kubernetes and a lot of these other orchestration systems that are being built. Microsoft just released this thing called Dapper, or just got to version 1, which is like another platform that, again, is mostly based on containers and things like this and Kubernetes. So it's important that you understand at least the basics of those and how, if you're writing applications, they're going to fit into those systems. And then the other thing is that we are living in an API world. So something you need to know is almost any service you want to access nowadays, whether it's billing, whether it's sending text messages, whether it's doing facial recognition, whether it's encoding text or audio and translating it into text, all of those things happen through APIs. This wasn't a thing many, many, many years ago. There used to be different types of interfaces into it. Almost everything you do now is dealing with APIs. So understanding how APIs work and being comfortable with communicating with APIs and just different formats and different ways to deal with them is super important. And then the last thing I'll say, just because I'm a huge fan of this as well, is I think you should understand and know serverless and what that actually is, what it actually means, because it is a significant and a serious advantage for companies who want to build and move very, very quickly. And if you can go into your first job or whatever job you're in, and somebody says, hey, we need something that translates this data and grabs this from this API and puts it over here, you can write that in a half an hour using serverless, as opposed to having to set up containers or get an EC2 instance up and running or things like that. So if you can do that and be super productive, you can make significant impacts and really accelerate your team and remove a lot of those blockers that just sort of exist in the development world. So that would be my advice. APIs, learn serverless, but also understand containers, because they're not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, the flexibility of serverless, it's incredible. I mean, it offers such as development speed that you can just test completely products or just really, really fast. So yeah, I totally agree on that. Let's change the topic a little bit. Me as a consultant, one of the most common questions I get is about which cloud provider to use.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you already mentioned a few of them, like AWS, DigitalOcean, Azure, but there are some differences between of them. I would like to know which are the key factors you consider when choosing a cloud provider.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the big things when you're choosing a cloud provider is to think about the ecosystem. It's fine if a cloud provider has a whole bunch of services and tools and things that you can use, but then nobody's using them and nobody's writing about them. And AWS clearly is the market leader at this point with the most services, and they have a really good program. I mean, I'm one of their heroes in their heroes program, and we basically, just promote AWS because we're so involved in that ecosystem. But I will say that as good as AWS is, it has all kinds of problems, right? None of these cloud providers are perfect. You're going to have to deal with limitations. You're going to have to, create workarounds. I will say any limitations or workarounds that you need to do are a million times easier than ones you would have to do if you're building this yourself. So don't let that dissuade you from moving to the cloud if you haven't made that jump yet. But there are a lot of other cloud providers, public cloud providers, that are amazing. Microsoft Azure, as you mentioned, they are probably the next in line in terms of what they've done and invested in serverless. And with Microsoft Azure functions, and then they've got logic apps, they've got durable functions, they've got all these really cool things they can do, really cool input and bindings or triggers and bindings concept that they have, which is different than the way that sort of AWS handles events coming into serverless functions. So there's a lot of really cool things happening in other clouds. In terms of Google, Google Cloud Platform, they just released Google Workflows, I think they're called, which are sort of like step functions, so you can do some more orchestration with serverless functions, which is great. I know I'm talking heavily about serverless, but I think again, going just back to the overall, the overall thing, DigitalOcean is a cloud sort of, but not in the sense that, I think AWS and Azure and Google and even IBM Cloud has made a significant investment. They were the ones who created OpenWhisk originally. So that's now part of IBM Cloud Functions. So there's a lot of really cool things happening in all these different clouds. What I would say is that, pick the one that your team's familiar with. If they're not familiar with any, then again, maybe start doing some research. But I think that there are valid reasons for you to choose any one of those clouds out there. And I don't think you'd be disappointed with any one that you choose. Again, I'm just heavily involved in AWS, so I know all the ins and outs of what's available there, which is super important. And again, I would say, pick a cloud provider, right? Don't try to master 3 or 4 of them. I think it's just smarter to pick one and put your efforts behind that. But right now, if I had to choose, me personally, I'd choose AWS, but I could certainly make the case for Azure. If you were, if you're a serious developer and there's a lot of, and you're willing to get into some of the weeds, then I think IBM Cloud is another one. I'm always leery about Google because they are always creating things and then, dropping them. So that always makes me nervous. I haven't seen much of it in their cloud, but I don't know, that seems like a risky bet, just the way that they churn products there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. And actually, this leads very, very good to the next question because it's related to multi-cloud. You already mentioned that it's better to focus on just one cloud than on more than one.
Right.
But it's become kind of trendy, or it's kind of, I would like to know your opinion about that, about those multi-cloud approaches.
Right. Well, so it's important, I think, that we have a common definition of what multi-cloud is, because I think people say multi-cloud and sometimes they think platform or cloud agnostic, right? Meaning that they could build an application that they could install on any one of these public clouds. I think that if you are trying to be cloud agnostic, that's a fool's errand. There are too many good services specifically on AWS and specifically on Azure and IBM excuse me, that you would want to use those services natively, right? You wouldn't want to. I mean, if I'm on AWS and I'm using NoSQL, I'm gonna use DynamoDB, right? I'm not gonna try to install Cassandra or use one of their Cassandra rings or something like that, or even Mongo. I'm gonna use the best of breed there, which would be DynamoDB. If I'm on Azure, I'm gonna be using Cosmos DB or something like that. So I'm gonna use very specific tools for the platform that I'm on. So for you to try to build something that sort of uses the lowest common denominator, and this is something that Forrest Brazil has talked about, and Linda Nichols has talked about this idea of sort of designing for this lowest level, then you're not taking advantage of the cloud. So if you're trying to be cloud agnostic, I think that's a really, really bad idea. Now, there are plenty of reasons why you might want to use BigQuery instead of, say, I don't know, Athena or something like that. And if you want to use BigQuery in Google Cloud, but you want to use AWS to generate a lot of your workloads, there's a perfectly good case for sending data into BigQuery there and using BigQuery for its capabilities. There's also, if you think about it, and we talked about the API economy a little bit, or that we're living in a world of APIs. And if you think about it, why isn't Twilio its own cloud? Sort of, you know what I mean? And why isn't Stripe its own thing? So if we think about multi-cloud in terms of using multiple services from across multiple providers, that's how I kind of see multi-cloud now. And I think that is just a necessity. So if you're building apps in AWS, but you need to communicate with Stripe and Twilio and some of those other things, then that's perfect. That's a nice multi-cloud thing. If you want to send some data over to Google for certain processing, or you have a pipeline maybe that runs there, or there's some other ways that you can use other clouds to handle very specific types of workloads. Actually, with the last startup that I was at, we used IBM Watson to do our natural language processing because we thought it was better than Amazon's Recognition or Comprehend, I think. So it was better than any other service out there. But even though our majority of our workloads ran on AWS, we still used IBM in order to use this one part. So I think a multi-cloud strategy like that makes a lot of sense and essentially allows you to use the best of breed in any one of these given clouds. So if you do want to spread your workloads out, like maybe there's not a cloud, maybe there's not a cloud region in Australia and you need to provide, for your current, whatever your provider is, they don't have a region in Australia. Well, maybe you have to run a small workload there, or maybe you have to use an edge network, which is another thing, whether you're using Fastly or Cloudflare or something like that. So there are a lot of variables to take into consideration here. And I think it just all ties back into what you think multi-cloud is, or how you define it. But again, platform or cloud agnostic, bad idea. Embracing the best services in multiple clouds, I think that's a really wise choice.
Yeah, I actually agree on what you are saying, since choosing the best service that suits your application, it's always an improvement. But adding a lot of complexity and adding new cloud providers just as a backup or just as I don't know, the use case, this only adds complexity and another platform to maintain. So at the end, it's also the cost will also increase, and I don't see so many benefits on that. So I totally agree on what you said.
Right, and the other thing about multi-cloud too, and this is just a story that I have that's probably pretty familiar. We had built all of our stuff for a startup on AWS, and my CEO came to me and said, "Hey, we just received this offer to have $100,000 in credits for Google Cloud platform. So how hard would it be for us to move, our services from AWS to Google Cloud platform?" And basically I said, I have no idea, because if you do, I won't be here to help you, because I don't know GCP anywhere near as well as I know AWS. And that is that's a trap that you're going to fall into. You need to hire engineers in your organization that can have focus on, that can develop expertise in one of these clouds. And for them to divide their attention between multiple clouds and try to learn different things, including the security and the networking and whatever other limitations and failover states there are and things like that, or failure states, that's a huge ask for developers. And I think you could seriously derail a developer if you said, hey, we need you to move now from AWS to Azure, or we need you to understand both fully so that we have the best, we have this best, best practices followed in both of those clouds. I think that's a lot to ask of a developer. And I think if you're a developer, I think you can do pretty well for yourself if you just stay focused on one cloud. I mean, you should really expand your knowledge of that cloud, but I think you can stay focused. And as long as you're aware of maybe some of the other things happening there, you don't need to know the ins and outs or the details of everything else.
Well, really, really interesting. I'm thinking about that actually. But let's continue. We already mentioned a lot of cloud providers such as AWS. You even mentioned IBM or DigitalOcean. How do you think in the future is going to evolve this cloud market share? Do you see the same players continuing being on the top, or do you see some changes? Do you see the small players going up?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. I think that AWS is going to continue to dominate for quite some time. But I think AWS has made some missteps. I think AWS certainly has to separate itself from Amazon.com, the main sort of parent company. I think that there are many reasons why people, when you associate the two, that could affect things. I know that, even though they have said that this is not the case, I've understood it that people who are partners with companies like Walmart, and again, they have denied this, I believe, but companies who are partners with Walmart have been asked not to develop their technologies on AWS because Amazon.com competes with Walmart. Again, I don't know if that's true. I don't want to get in trouble for saying that. But again, it would make sense, right? It would make sense that why would you want someone to develop on your biggest competitor? I mean, that seems kind of difficult to sort of rationalize. So I think that AWS, until they decide to break off from Amazon.com completely, that there's going to be a big push for moving to other clouds for some of these things. I don't think it's going to hurt them in any meaningful way. They're still going to be the market leader for quite some time, if not forever, especially if they keep up at the pace they are right now. But I do think that companies like Microsoft are doing a really, really good job of meeting developers where they are, meeting companies where they are, trying to find the right solutions at the right time for you, and help you sort of start migrating workflows away from more traditional ways that you're building it. So I think that is, I think that's super important. Again, I mentioned GCP. They're still making improvements, but they just seem really, really slow. They're like 2 years behind everything, or 3 years behind everything else, where I think Azure is nipping on their heels. I will say I am super impressed by what Fastly is doing in terms of how they're sort of moving compute to the edge, and what they're doing with WebAssembly and building some standards around that. And I think that some of these cloud or some of these edge providers are going to be more important much sooner than we may have thought. Sort of if you're still thinking serverless needs another 5 years to develop, maybe edge computing needs another 10. But certainly I think that by the time we get to 2030 or so, you're going to have a lot of applications that are running on a telephone pole down the street, or in a cell phone tower, and things like that, or in the stadium that you're at for a particular sporting event or something like that. You're going to have compute running so close to you, it is going to be lightning fast. So I think that's something to watch. But yeah, I don't know. IBM is IBM. They're old blue, I think is what they call them. And there's a reason for that. I mean, they're lagging behind, I think. So I do see market share, maybe evening off a little bit. But I think AWS, at least for the next many, many years, is going to continue to dominate.
I also agree on that. However, I would like to add that, for example, Alibaba Cloud is also growing very, very, very fast.
Right. Well, we didn't talk about China yet.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Yeah, I'm also in Europe talking with a lot of enterprises, and I have also heard multiple times enterprises talking about AWS and Amazon.com and the competitors. So it's not just Walmart. I have heard that more times, and I totally agree on that they have to go a little bit on the side and forget about Amazon.com, because it's not helping at all, so to say.
Right.
But in any case, let's talk now about China, as you already mentioned, since we see how massive and how fast this. Just talking about the cloud market share and the cloud market itself, and we see, for example, two players, kind of Tencent and Alibaba, growing very fast. We see also a lot of companies in China moving to the cloud. They are at the moment a little bit behind talking about cloud, but they are moving also very, very fast. How do you expect this to evolve in the coming years?
Well, I mean, China's interesting, right? Because in order for you to have a company in China, it has to be a Chinese company, right? So it has to be owned by a Chinese entity. And so I know AWS has a Chinese-owned version of AWS that's sort of a copy of AWS that runs in there. But I think the two that you mentioned, Tencent and Alibaba, that's actually it's really interesting how fast they are growing. And of course, China is a huge market. So, I mean, you have a lot of potential customers, and with them being native Chinese companies, they have that advantage of being in that ecosystem. But to assume that they're only going to serve that market would be a bad assumption, because they are growing very, very fast. And again, this is something I heard, and I really wish I had looked this up, but I think Tencent powers IBM's. Is it IBM or Microsoft's edge network or something like that? Like there's some relationships going on there, and I could be completely wrong about that, but I know that Tencent is growing a very large edge network as well. And the cool thing about Tencent, again, from somebody who loves serverless, Serverless Inc., the makers of the serverless framework, have a relationship with Tencent. And Tencent is actually very aggressively building serverless functionality using the serverless framework as sort of the deployment mechanism, as their system to actually deploy serverless applications. So I think that's really, really interesting, because the advantage you have of emerging markets is that these, sort of first world countries, or these countries that come out with technology first and are early adopters of technology, like cell phones, for example. If you think of cell phones in the United States, started with these horrible, analog things with whatever, and then they upgraded them, and then there was like CDMA or something, I forget all the acronyms. And so we went through these horrible iterations of technology, and then as soon as some of these other countries start getting cell phones, they're on iPhones. Like they just immediately start there, or they started, or even Europe, I think, in most cases, started on GSM-based technology, which was much better than the CDM. And again, I'm probably getting these acronyms wrong, but that's what happens with technology. So I feel like as the market emerges in China, that if these cloud providers are starting you on just these amazing technologies like serverless and containers and some of these things, then you just skip all of that horrible stuff that was before, you know what I mean? And the clunky stuff that was before, and you just jump right into these really innovative things. And so I think that's what's happening, and that's what you're going to see with China and with Tencent and Alibaba. And again, I think they're going all in on serverless and of course cloud native, obviously. But I think that's going to be a pretty big expanding market. Now, is that going to make a huge impact on the rest of the world? In terms of their overall market share, I think that's going to be tough, because I can tell you right now, sort of in the United States, and again, we don't need to get into geopolitical discussions, but certainly China and the United States have a tension, maybe a healthy tension, but a tension nonetheless. And so I think that there will be a lot of pushback on companies in the U.S., starting to deploy things to Tencent, maybe in order to get into the Chinese market, but probably not to run their majority of their workloads. I don't know how other countries feel about that as well. I mean, the United States is probably somewhat unique in that capacity. But But yeah, so I think they're going to grow. I think the rest of the world could adopt them very, very quickly. But yeah, are they going to be a massive player in the public cloud market? I think absolutely. And again, as China continues to grow, and I mean, China has more cities of over 5 million people than any country in the world. I mean, it's insane how fast they're growing and how quickly they're what's the right word? Not evolving, but that they're metropolitanized. That's not a word, but anyways, that they're basically growing cities and growing these technology centers and things like that. So I think it's really interesting. I'm going to keep my eye on it, and I'll be interested to see how the continued relationship with Serverless Inc. and Tencent go. But yeah, I mean, it's exciting.
Definitely. It's very exciting. And I think that we could talk about this topic hours and hours. However, we are almost finishing the podcast. Just the last two questions. First of all, I would like you to share with us one of the latest things that you learned about the cloud. It can be a technical topic, a tool, strategic, whatever you like to share. Sure.
Yeah. Wow, what have I try to learn so much all the time. So what was the last thing I learned or something recent that I learned? Let's see. I mean, I was really interested by a lot of the releases that came out at reInvent 2020. So some of the things with tumbling windows and the batch windows and things like that are running within with Lambda functions. So Kinesis allows you to do tumbling windows, and then SQS now, which is a queue service, allows you to do batch windows. So really interesting, just learning a little bit more about that in terms of how you could take advantage of those so that you don't have to manually store state and be writing back and forth to a database, because with functions as a service, it's stateless, right? So every time it's spun up again, it doesn't have any information there. So with these two services, it lets you actually write information back to the service that polls it and invokes I'm getting way technical here, but basically invokes that and then allows you to pass some state through, so you can do longer aggregations over a short time span. So that's something that I've been playing around with a little bit, but super interesting, because again, it opens up a whole bunch of workloads that you might not have been able to do in the past without writing a lot of extra code to, again, store stuff somewhere else and potentially slowing down your batch pipeline.
Well, definitely really interesting, and looking forward to see what comes out of this. Just the last question, which is basically information. You know that there is out there a lot of information, not only about cloud, but also about serverless, about multiple topics. And I would like to know, which sources do you use to keep yourself up to date?
Well, again, I said I'm a sort of a news junkie when it comes to cloud news. And I mentioned my newsletter here, Off by None. So I actually have a system that I built that aggregates feeds from AWS and from Google and Azure, and then it looks at dev.to and Medium and Twitter, and I pull in all this information and then kind of sift through it. So I'm probably a little unique in terms of how I get my information, because I specifically seek out as much as I can find so that I can whittle it down and share that with the email subscribers. So that's basically where I get my information. So if you don't want to have to do what I do, then just subscribe to the newsletter at offbynone.io, and then I'll do it for you. And then you'll have a nice compact view every week of all the latest things.
That's a very good sentence to finish the podcast. So you already know, get subscribed to that newsletter. And so that was it, basically. The time flies. And I would like to thank you for participating, for sharing your experience and thoughts about cloud and all related topics. And it's been a pleasure for me having you here.
Well, I appreciate it. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, Jeremy_Daly on Twitter, and then serverlesschats.com. And like I said, offbynone.io for the newsletter. Yeah,
I will leave definitely all your social networks in the description. So in case anyone wants to contact you. And thank you very much again.
All right. Thank you, Pablo. Appreciate it.
Okay. See you in the next podcast. Bye-bye.